Hi, everybody. So I see Rosemary's here, which is always awesome. And guessing that means that we have translation tonight. Okay, so I will do the reference to the announcement.
Councilmember Lamnin, just a reminder, we're not streaming live tonight. The recording of the meeting will be available 24 hours on the city's YouTube channel, but within 24 hours after our meeting.
Okay, is there a reason we're
That's
not
on the agenda.
Okay.
Well, just to be clear, the reason is because we had a planning commission meeting tonight as well.
Oh, right, of course.
And so we got trying to live stream both of them was a little complicated. So
Totally.
We will try to avoid that in the future, but couldn't do that this time.
Only so many days in a week. No, that's fine. And people can participate in the Zoom, just not see that.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. All good. Okay, Mark is here, Aisha's here. We'll get started in about a minute, but anything else we need to go? No?
Just real quick, I may turn my screen off and on a little bit. I took my dog to the vet yesterday, and she's heavily medicated right now. So she's got the infamous cone of shame on, but she's asleep right now. So hopefully she's heavily sedated right now, but she'll, if she wakes up, I'll have to turn the screen off.
Okay.
Every time we have a meeting, it's good to get an update on Yuma.
Right. There
No.
Okay. Well, wishing her speedy healing. And okay, are we ready to start? Hearing no objection, I'll call this meeting to order. Thanks, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Housing and Homelessness Task Force of the City of Hayward. As most meetings are still happening, we are once again meeting via Zoom this evening, and the video will be available after 24 hours on our website and YouTube channels. So can I have an announcement about Spanish interpretation services?
Sure. Good evening. Tonight we're offering Spanish interpretation service. If you're using the Zoom application to join the meeting, you'll be able to select English and Spanish. The interpretation service is now live. Panelists can now select English on their interpretation toolbar. Attendees wishing to listen to the interpreter will need to select Spanish and click on the mute original audio. Thank you. The Spanish interpreter will now make the announcement in Spanish. Thank you.
Thank you. Rosemary, did you need?
Hello. Yes, I will be only in only the English will be able to hear me. So I don't know how useful that would be. So, bienvenidos a todos. Mi nombre es Rosemary Vázquez y voy a ser el intérprete el día de hoy. Si desea utilizar el servicio de interpretación, simplemente busque en la parte de abajo y escoge el idioma que seleccione.
Bienvenidos. Les queremos avisar que esta noche estamos ofreciendo el servicio de interpretación en español. Por favor, seleccione el idioma en la parte de abajo de su pantalla, donde se encuentra el globo con las opciones de interpretación. Usted va a seleccionar español y va a poner en silencio o mute el audio original. Gracias.
Gracias, Dana. So now we'll call the roll.
Good evening again. Council Member Wahab.
Here.
Council Member Salinas.
Present.
Council Member Lamnin.
Present.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. First order of business. Let's see. Actually, first order of business is public comments. If we have any that are on items not on the agenda, or items related to the housing element, or the rent stabilization, we'll take those comments on during that agenda item. But if there's anything that's not on the agenda, I'll open up public comment for that. And is there an announcement about how people can participate?
Okay, thank you. If you wish to speak and you're using the Zoom application, please click the raise hand button. If you're dialing in, press star 9 to raise your hand and star 6 to unmute yourself. If you are streaming the meeting through your computer using Zoom application, but dialing in by a phone, please unmute yourself so that we don't have disruptive feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any raised hands for the public comment section. So we'll move on to the approval of minutes.
I'll move the item.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Do you need a roll call, Yolanda, or can we do that by acclamation? You're muted. Yolanda, you're muted.
Okay, Council Member Wahab,
Yes.
Council Member Salinas,
Yes.
Council Member Lamnin.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minutes approved as written. Thank you to the staff for writing those. And we'll go on to our first informational item, an update about the city's housing element, climate action plan, environmental justice, and safety elements. And
I guess I'd just jump in here. How are you guys
come
doing
on
tonight? I have prepared a little presentation, so I guess I'm just going to share my screen with you and pull up the PowerPoint. Hold on one moment. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up if you can see my, okay, you see it. Okay, I'm going to start the slideshow. Okay, so it's really nice to be here tonight and what I think is going to be the first of a lot of meetings where we're going to talk about the housing element. So how to turn that off. But this is an informal sort of like just very broad overview of the housing element, where we are, where we're going, and to give you all an opportunity to sort of weigh in on some of the earliest work that we're doing. And that's really around the question of outreach and how we're going to be reaching out to groups that are underrepresented in the community that have not typically come out to these kinds of sort of big meetings. So with that, I'm just going to give you kind of a broad overview and background on the housing element. Let's see. So what is a housing element? I'm just going to start at the beginning, and then I know you guys probably already know this, but this is for people that are listening and just also to start getting it out there. So anybody who wants to sort of like get in at the ground level will understand that the housing element is one of 8 mandatory elements of the general plan. It is required, unlike the other elements of the general plan, to be updated every 8 years. And it's also the only element that's certified by the state housing, Department of Housing and Community Development. Local jurisdictions are also responsible for reporting about progress on the housing element every year. It's called the annual progress report. And if jurisdictions don't turn in those annual progress reports, we could lose funding. We could lose like infrastructure funding. So it is, the state does take the housing element very seriously. In the city of Hayward's housing element, this cycle is being combined with general plan amendments related to the climate action plan update, environmental justice, and safety elements. So why do we need a housing element? Basically, it's an opportunity for community conversations around housing issues. In our case, in the city of Hayward, because we're combining it with those other updates, it's also an opportunity to talk about housing in conjunction with environmental justice, climate change, transportation impacts, safety and hazard planning. And so, our staff felt like this was a really good opportunity to use the synergy of these conversations and having everybody. It's a lot to ask somebody to think about it all together, but really that's the way you come to the best solutions, is if we're thinking about it all as one plan. And we do have, it's multi-departmental in the city. We have lots of staff who are highly coordinated on this. And we also want to take advantage of the benefits of having combined outreach and getting out into the community in lots of different ways on these topics. State law doesn't require that jurisdictions build or finance housing, but we do have to plan for it. And non-compliance or not showing adequate sites inventory or meeting the statutory requirements could lead to cities being sued, losing even more sort of discretionary approval status than we already have. And it could also make the city ineligible for community development and infrastructure grants and funding sources, even more than just what you'd lose by not reporting your APR. So as I mentioned, the housing element does have like statutory requirements. It's required by state law. And so these are the main elements that are required in a housing element. A needs assessment, so you're looking at demographics, existing projected housing needs, really having a special emphasis on special needs groups. You're going to look at a constraints analysis. That's looking at governmental, market, environmental. So zoning is seen as a constraint. Market, the cost of lumber is, so the housing element will like kind of look at all those issues that we're facing right now, the cost of land and all the unique issues in the Bay Area. You're required to have a community engagement component. And I think, as I mentioned in the staff report, this cycle, because of the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements that have been added onto this housing element update, there's some really specific and robust requirements in terms of community engagement, and that we have to show community engagement throughout the entire process. And include all segments of the population. A housing sites inventory, and that's where we get into the RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and where we're going to put all this housing that we've been allocated, and then a set of policies and programs supporting housing preservation and development, especially at varying income levels. So I mentioned RHNA, or the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and it's worth just sort of going through basically what that is as well. So sort of preceding the housing element update, the state projects out the housing need for the state as a whole for the next 8 years. So that's where you sort of see that alignment with the housing element updates. And the state takes that gigantic number and allocates it out to the councils of governments across the state. There's like 23 councils of governments in California. In the Bay Area, we have the ABAG, or the Area Association of Bay Area Governments, covers the 9-county Bay Area. The Bay Area was allocated 441,176 units in this cycle, which is a 200%, over 200% increase over the last cycle. And that total is broken down into income categories. So very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And then just to give you sort of like an idea, every jurisdiction experienced an increase in the allocation. Some was like 1,000% in Southern California. So it was definitely, I think that what we're seeing is that there's a pent up demand. And I think as the Housing Task Force, you're hearing this. And so the state's really pushing those numbers out into the local jurisdictions, saying you're being responsible for building this, or at least making a plan to build it in the next 8 years. So that 441,000 number goes to ABAG, and they created a housing methodology committee that has met over the past year and created all these sort of algorithms, and they basically allocated all those units to counties and then to local jurisdictions. Those numbers came out in May of 2021. They're not finalized yet because some jurisdictions have appealed the numbers, but we're anticipating that those numbers will be finalized by this fall in time for us to really be starting these housing elements and sites inventories in earnest. So this is just like a crazy, I don't expect, like, I don't even understand this graphic, but it sort of describes ABAG's methodology. And the thing to remember is they're trying to balance placement of housing with, they're really focusing, I mentioned this in the staff report, on allocating housing to high opportunity areas, which are areas that have good schools, that have access to parks, that have grocery stores, that are transit rich, that are, you know, they call those high opportunity areas because they just, by virtue of living near them and in them, you accrue sort of like benefits from that. And then also allocating lots of housing near jobs or transit, again, aligning that housing with the greenhouse gas emissions targets and the climate action planning that we're doing on a region-wide basis. So this is how they sort of like, they have all these algorithms. I think I linked to it in the staff report. If you want to take a deep dive, there's like a giant report on this, and you can get in the weeds as deep as you want. So Hayward's RHNA, this in the last cycle is up at the top of the table, the green table. It was a total of 3,920 units broken out into very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And then our draft allocation, which again came out in May and will be finalized this fall, is on the bottom. It's about a 700 unit increase, which is not much more. There's other jurisdictions that experienced a significantly higher increase by many, like hundreds of %. So we definitely, I mean, I think that, you know, we've done a relatively good job of like producing housing in comparison to other jurisdictions. And, you know, we have access to transit. So we are getting high numbers compared to some other jurisdictions, but not as high as others. And then I just also included down here at the bottom of the screen, just so you can get an idea of what, you know, Alameda County's area median income is, because those income levels are based, the baseline is the area median income. That's published every year, January of every year, and the state hands out, you know, the area median income for the county. In Alameda County for a family of 4, it's kind of in that red box. Right in the middle is $125,600. So for a very low income family of 4, they'd be making $68,500. Pretty high, like in terms of income, but in the Bay Area, unfortunately not. So when you're looking at like very low income housing, it's still not very super cheap. So that's how the income levels break down. And then I just wanted to give you a little snapshot of how we're doing with our current RHNA. And I think that you see this pretty regularly because we've been showing it in staff reports. But on the far left, you have the total RHNA allocation that we have, and then the units reported in our last annual progress report. And unfortunately, HCD, which, and I bring this up every single time I talk to anybody about this, the only thing that local jurisdictions have control over at this point is approving housing, right? But they don't count that. They count actual building permits pulled. So between submitting an application, going through the application process and the environmental review, a local jurisdiction approving that project and it's sitting on the books, that's like our pending approval numbers, or our estimated compliance, which is like, pretty high numbers. You're looking at, 42% of very low, 74% of low, but unfortunately we can't count them until the developer pulls the permits. So there's a bit of a disconnect between like what is within the realm of control of a local jurisdiction and what the state is saying they'll count. And so, what we'll do our best in this housing element is trying to convey that to the state and see how many units we can count towards, our future RHNA allocation. And then it's also important to note that the city has well exceeded our above moderate income unit allocation for the reporting period, so it's not shown on the table. So stepping back into the housing element presentation, I just want to give you an idea of where we are. In July, the award for the contract, the award for the housing element contract preparation and cap and everything was awarded. In August, we had a sort of soft kickoff. So we've already started working. Right now, it's sort of shown, September shown in the red star. We're drafting our outreach plan. We're doing some of these early meetings. We're going to have a joint planning commission city council meeting later this month to not only talk about the housing element, do sort of this baseline information, but also to talk about development of objective design and development standards. And then moving over the course of the next 6 months, we'll be unrolling that outreach plan, doing a lot of conversations. I've kind of already started doing it, that sort of relational work, like just having conversations with people that are out in the community, asking them like, who should I talk to? What groups should I go to? And starting to just make those relationships. Next summer, 2022, we'll be working on the plans and environmental analysis. By fall, my goal is to submit a draft to HCD for them to review. So we get those early comments, have our public hearings in the winter, and then submit our housing element to HCD by January 2023, which is a deadline. So, the task that's in front of us now is our outreach plan. We're currently developing it with a focus on engaging underrepresented groups. It'll target communities, it'll forge partnerships, and then tailor methods to what those groups need. We want to use like sort of plain language. We want it to be culturally informed. And we want to recognize that other people have like other priorities, and they're like, trying to just work and take care of their kids and do all the hundreds of other things they have in their lives, and they might not want to participate in this. So trying to find ways to make it interesting and engaging and worthwhile. And I already mentioned this to date. I've started sort of just meeting with people and chatting with them, telling them about the housing element and what it is. We're also going to have a housing element little presentation as part of the City Hall to You outreach, and we'll start to be doing that and just going out into the community. Ideally, we want to have small grants and stipends that we would give to community groups or groups that would partner with us, that we could just sort of like go and maybe those groups present and we offer support, we offer materials, we I don't know, like I have all these ideas. We'll create a housing element game or a podcast. It's a lot. We'll see what gets done, but I think that there's a lot of really cool stuff out there. So we're researching it. And I think with that, Oh, I have one other task as part of this presentation, which is to give you a sort of overview on housing related grants. The housing element's one of them. This is also in the staff report. I briefly mentioned we're going to have a joint work session later this month on a comprehensive rezone and development of objective design guidelines. And the comprehensive rezone, what that is aligning zoning districts with general plan designation. So it's not like changing land uses, that it's already been identified in the general plan as a kind of higher density area. And then development of objective design standards. My colleague Elizabeth Blanton is drafting an RFP right now for that. And again, we'll be discussing that later. The density bonus update has not started, but I have heard that it's imminent. It's also the state has stepped in, so we're basically just going to have to be rolling back our old ordinance and making sure it's consistent with the state's density bonus updates. They had a really big one in 2019, another one in 2020. The housing element update, which I just let you know about, the project is underway. ADU ordinance update is not started yet. And then we were recently awarded a REAP grant for affordable housing ordinance materials and a program to convert tax defaulted properties, which hasn't started but has a longer, because we were just awarded that grant. It goes out till September of 2023. So with that, you take some questions, also any feedback you have about outreach, your ideas, groups that you think I should talk to, individuals, and then just general thoughts. And that concludes this presentation.
Fantastic, thank you. And so as we do in this meeting, I'll go first to the attendees in case there are any public comments on the presentation. And I see Colin has his hand up. So.
Hello.
There you are.
Yes. My name is Colin Thormoto. I'm a member of the Hayward Collective, and I just wanted to take the time to thank the Homelessness and Housing Task Force and all of the city staff who've worked so hard to get the plans for the housing element going. We've already met with Leah and Christina and look forward to supporting the city in its efforts to use the housing element to address the legacy of housing inequality and the ongoing crisis of unhoused persons in our community, not to mention the ongoing climate crisis. So just wanted to register our support and say thank you for all the hard work, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Fair enough. Yes, certainly. Definitely appreciate the staff's work and appreciate the collective and the various other community groups being committed to doing this work. So thank you to the team. Any other public comments? Hearing none, I will go back to my colleagues for comments or questions. Seeing none. Go ahead, Aisha.
Thank you. So I appreciate this, and I'm glad we get a chance to look at it ahead of time. I could have sworn that we made a bigger impact in our low/extremely low, just based on, are we including the Caltrans properties?
That should include the Caltrans properties. I just got that table sort of yesterday, so I wasn't looking too closely at it, but it should be all projects updated as of like last week.
Yeah, it should include all the Caltrans properties. I mean,
Okay.
technically they don't count we include them in our projections, but they won't count until they're actually pulling building permits.
Okay, so yeah, we're a ways away then, right?
Yeah, but our projections include those properties.
Okay, so I just want to clarify this. The estimated deficiency, so we're 58% deficient in very low income housing, 27% deficient, meaning that we are roughly about 70%, 72%, 73% hitting our target, correct? Am I reading this correct?
Yeah, and there's also a column that has the estimated compliance.
Okay.
So it's broken down, the two sides of that coin is broken down on that chart.
And this is projecting that with the Caltrans property, we're 73% hitting our low income housing and so forth, correct?
It is, and it's a projection because, as Leah mentioned, that we can't count anything until their permits are pulled, and that's contingent on the developer securing financing and starting the process to pull the permits and getting them approved.
Okay. Because I believe in previous conversation, and you guys can correct this, out of the entire Caltrans properties that we're dealing with, all the parcels, roughly 30% is dedicated to affordable housing, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and those are based on estimates because some of those parcels we don't have development proposals on, but we've made estimates of how many units overall we're assuming. But yeah, it's somewhere between 25 to 35% affordable.
Okay. The bigger the number, the better. I would be more supportive of. The other pieces, the ADUs don't count, correct?
Well, ADUs count towards the moderate income category.
Right, but not low and very low, right? Okay.
Not unless they're.
deed restricted.
That's what I was going to say.
The next piece is I do appreciate that I really do appreciate the environmental justice and safety element / climate action plan being kind of like cohesive into this, because as we know, anything we develop also with the burning and so forth, it's, we want to make sure all the material as well as we're, making it as clean and green as possible as we develop and things like that. The one thing I did not really see, and I know we've talked about it slightly in the past, I know even the collective has brought this up, and I was a little surprised not to hear it today, the equity plan. When we do develop or we do have a project forward, so an equity kind of analysis of what does this mean, especially as we are moving into upzoning certain single family homes, right? There's concern that, and I think we've talked about it here on this task force of the single family homes in the flatlands versus the hills, and just making sure that there's an equity component. We saw in the last economic development committee, there's, people trying to take advantage of a single family home and try to build a 48 unit hotel, right? Under 5,000 square feet. So just making sure that it makes sense, it works. We're not congesting certain neighborhoods just because we're, really thinking this through and really planning that. So I do just want to kind of include that if we can, as well as, I know I asked about this in the past, but it was stated that because it's such a deep analysis that it would require a little bit more time and a little bit more effort. As we look at our housing element completely, making sure that any rule or law that we put into place with our housing element that was, let's say, directly or indirectly redlining certain neighborhoods, that we remove any of the, a law from 1970 something, right? That was not fair to our community members and so forth. Just making sure that while we are scanning this and looking through this, and I know you guys are probably reading the same paragraphs multiple times too, that we correct those as we move this forward. Right now is the time. So I would like to just add those few points. Other than that, I do appreciate it. I will say that I am very much interested in making sure that new arrivals and our immigrant community can be able to, survive and live here, as well as being able to reach out in multiple languages. I know that's difficult and hard, but it's also something that we owe to our community members. So I just want to highlight that as well. But I do appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to the more meaty plan moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Salinas, did you have?
Yeah, I know, it's, I think this might be my second round on the housing element. And so, which is good. And I have seen a difference, so which is good. And so I'll just say that what I really want to just focus on now is just the outreach component. I know, over the last, I would say over the last 5 or so years, there has been, an increase in community engagement, and different groups have certainly, stepped up and, and want to be a part of this. Conversely, there's still a lot of groups out there. There's still a lot of, populations out there, subpopulations that are not engaged for whatever reason. And so if there's one thing this pandemic has informed us is there are groups, neighborhood groups, that are organized and who are, very willing, very capable, and enthusiastic to engage. With that said, what I would just suggest when we start to do outreach, reach out to the family engagement specialists at the school sites, and particularly, at Glassbrook, Rrso, Tyrell, Tennyson, Chavez, Harder, right? And Palmacia. So I'll, not to show off that I know all the names of the elementary schools in Hayward, but but the thing is those are, great sites to connect with. And I think that, the people involved in the parent engagement centers, they're just not engaged in the school sites, right? They're also heavily engaged in the neighborhood. Another group that I think is important to have a part of this is the Tiburcio Vasquez Health Clinic. The promotoras. Here is a group. In fact, this could be a good link to their. They do a lot of training and of course health promotion. But now that we're really tying the link between public health and housing, this could be that entree into that discussion. This could be an added element to their curriculum for training, and I think that this could be, this would be very interesting. I can give you the names of the people to that, offline, but. And then, thirdly, I would just suggest, of course, working with the Hayward Promise neighborhood. And there's a lot of infrastructure there in community engagement that exists already. And so there could be, yet another connection point for engagement. So there's no lack of people to pull and draw from to really get this right. And I think, now post-pandemic, relatively speaking, as we sort of make this as we journey into this new pathway, we're going to be looking at housing a lot differently. And so just, be ready and I'm looking forward to approaching this with really a totally different mindset and see how this works. So hopefully that gives you enough to work with. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great suggestions. And I'll add to the school thoughts also about, for instance, Pioneers for Hope at East Bay, who work with students and, the analogous folks at Chabot. The other one that came to mind was CRIL, the Community Resources for Independent Living, has a lot of housing issues come up, and there are specific funding streams for housing for folks with disabilities that may, having that into consideration. And then the other piece I was thinking about, is one of the pieces that has been on the back burner for a long time for decent reasons is the whole universal design concepts. And so, while we may not get to everything in that, are there some components of that that really make sense to be thinking about at this time? And then, let's see, will the work plan that the incentivizing housing work plan, do you envision that elements of that will get folded into this, or how do those complement each other or not?
Yes, so the incentives to housing work plan did include the housing element. It also included looking at whether upzoning was appropriate. So part of this is looking at that element, also increasing the areas where shelters can be provided. I think those were the main three, if anybody remembers anything else that was on there, but the intent was to fold in not only those from the incentive from housing production plan, but some of the items that are on the strategic roadmap.
I think we have a future agenda to go over that and kind of crosswalk what was in the incentives plan with the roadmap, with the housing element. So that'll be part of a future agenda too, is to kind of make sure we're keeping track of all of those different items. And I think also just to acknowledge that there's a lot of state legislation that's moving faster than we are on our incentives housing work plan. And I feel like we're moving fast. So just, the latest legislation, if signed by the governor, related to upzoning, and also some of with Councilmember Wahhab's comment about racial covenants. I know at one point there was even state legislation to just extinguish statewide any of those covenants that existed. So as part of the housing element, we'll keep track of those efforts and make sure that we're incorporating them into the document too.
Appreciate all of that. And yeah, I wanted to pick up on the redlining comment from Councilmember Wahhab as well. Sorry, Mayor Pro Tem Wahhab. I know from having done a little research on this as well, that it's unfortunately property to property is the way the state currently manages that. So it's exciting to hear that there could be some state law looking at that. Sounds like maybe not moving forward yet, but hopefully. That said, there is a form apparently that the state, it's not the assessor's office, it's the controller's office, Melissa Wilkes' office, has for anybody that wants to remove those covenants from their property. They can do it free. And so if we're doing community workshops, maybe it would make sense to have that form there.
That's a great idea. And I just wanted to also acknowledge that some of these conversations will really be very explicit about kind of the racial, history in Hayward, and really acknowledge some of that history. And so part of that will be in these workshops that we're having, is really talking about that and being open about it and having those conversations, so that we're really tying more closely that history with some of the policies that we're trying to change and move forward. So just kind of to let everyone know and give a heads up on that.
No, I really appreciate how integrated this, as some of the folks have said. A couple other things and then we'll move on. One is, one of the things I'm hoping we have in those community conversations is a density conversation. The state is going to be upzoning. We will have talked about wanting to upzone, and we know the community is nervous about it. There's traffic impacts, there's parking impacts. Some of our communities were not designed to have as many people living there now as are, and yet we know we have to go denser. There's just no other way to get there. And so really having a thoughtful conversation, and I know Councilmember Salinas has brought this up in the past as well, to really have that conversation more broadly before we're trying to fight about it project to project.
Mm-hmm. I think we agree, and I think the housing element's a great place to have that larger, bigger picture conversation. And we've talked about it internally. There's kind of two ways. There's one which is tackling those issues and that providing that context when you're talking about density, but it's also accessing other voices that don't typically get involved. So we're really trying to take a two-prong approach where we're accessing new voices that may have different feelings about density, but also really having harder conversations about density and what that's meant over the history of Hayward in terms of, some of those racist policies and things in the past. So.
Very much so. Yeah. And this is where I know Zach Abadi has, I see your hand, Mark, and I'm just going to finish my comments and I'll come back to you. Zach Abadi has just recently completed a list of all the faith communities in our region, in our city. And so that may be a distribution network to get to what you were just talking about, Jennifer. And then lastly, is this thought about how we really can incentivize, support, stimulate the housing that we really need. we always build more market rate than we need. And we know that that's really not what our community needs, even though our RHNA number says we have to build some. But what would it look like to incentivize creating that every complex has some mix, every complex has mixed income, every complex has at least a couple of the categories that are not market rate at a level that really moves us along, kind of using the RHNA numbers maybe as the driver of how do we get to those categories that we never get enough housing in. Mm-hmm. And what are the tools the city has? And I know some of that's in the work plan, but
if I could just make another comment, I also think it's really important in the market rate category to be looking a little more carefully, because townhome home ownership units, no problem, we're getting a lot of those, but we aren't seeing a lot of multifamily construction where that's more rental, can be more affordable by design. And I think those tend to have higher costs, and so also tend to be closer to transit, that have those better kind of sustainable, impacts. So I think it might be good for us to be tracking a little more carefully the multifamily versus single family. So for instance, when we're talking about adopting a traffic impact fee, being really careful, maybe a townhome development may be able to afford that, but can a multifamily market rate, and do we want to be incentivizing certain types of market rate housing? So those are other things that I think are going to be important in that market rate discussion also.
Yeah, because certainly the market rate developers can sometimes build it much more efficiently than the nonprofit developers. And so can we leverage some of those savings and keep it low cost? And so if you will, sell it for less, take less of a profit margin, are there things that it makes sense for the city to waive, delay, etc. And so that everybody benefits from that lower cost, or those cost savings. Cool. This is exciting work. I'm very excited. Mark, did you have a final thought here?
Yeah, and I don't know, I know I don't want to be so RHNA number driven, and I know we're not. And I know a lot of cities out there, have just flat out, said no to, development. And I get that, and, it is what it is. But, it'll be interesting to see if perhaps what comes out of this conversation, in the future talks is, how much is enough of building in Hayward? Like, how much is enough? And, I know we can't go east or west or north or south, and we either got to, build up or down. So, I don't know. I guess I don't know if this is more of a rhetorical question, I don't know, how can we quantify, or how can we put a marker as to what is too much? And so that may come out in this conversation. I don't know if there is an indicator for that, but it may come out. I don't know whether that's even a community value, or that's something that the community determines. But so anyway, it's just something that just came to mind.
Yeah, well, and we'll see on the 23rd or 24th, the new census numbers will come out, and that may be a way to, if our city is growing in population. I mean, we already know we have overcrowded housing. If our city is continuing to grow in population, maybe a way to help measure how many, people to housing units, perhaps. Aisha?
Yeah, I have a question. I was told this a while ago, and I don't know if it's accurate or not, that it used to be that there were limitations of how many people per unit. Is that was that ever a rule, or?
I mean, not that
there's limitations in building code, but it's consistent with occupancy limit. So it's actually quite a few people who could occupy a residence, because it's based on the square footage and how many rooms. And then some affordable housing developments, but not, I haven't seen any in Hayward have a limit to the number of people depending on the size of the units. But I haven't seen any agreements in Hayward that restricts the occupancy. Mostly because there's also a concern with fair housing in terms of familial status. So if you limit the number of people who can occupy the unit, then you may be making housing unavailable to families.
Okay. And do we have like a rough range for, like, let's say a 2-bedroom apartment? What is the occupancy status or limitation there?
I wish I could remember. We did the calculation, I think, on a 600 square foot 1-bedroom apartment. And I think the limit may have been 10 people. It seems really high, but I think because it has to do, I think it increases 70 square feet, one person per 70 square feet of the living space. So it calculates to a fairly high number.
Okay. And the reason why I ask is because I know some people are concerned with the amount of people in one unit. So for example, I know there's a lot of students, 9, 10, even 13, I've heard, that are living in a 1 to 2 bedroom apartment. Some people, and I've mentioned this before, they're sleeping in the kitchen. One, I'm thinking fire hazard and things like that, if there was an emergency, and how quickly people can leave. But the other piece is also just quality of life issues. And so the area that I'm concerned is, as we move to upzoning, and it's not just locally us, where we are looking to see if we can push for upzoning in single family areas, but it's also, I know that right now there's something in the state that says, up to a single family can move up to 2 units, right? Rather than 1. I know we were looking at up to 4, but just making sure that when we do talk about this stuff, we do have to talk about parking and transportation and, what that population size and impact in that neighborhood looks like. I know people are trying to move into all new development has 0 parking assigned to it. That's not realistic, regardless of how transit oriented we are with 2 BART stations and 3 freeways and so forth. It's just really not realistic in the Bay Area, where people commute to their jobs. And public transportation is not fully, where it needs to be. So I do just want to highlight those things as we talk a little bit more about these particular aspects. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And congratulations on the grants, and looking forward to the conversations also on the tax defaulted properties and all of the great work that's going on. So many thanks.
Yeah, if I could just say, I just really want to commend Leah for all of her work on the housing element. Just done a great job. Has done this before, so we have a great fearless leader, and it's going to be a lot of work, and just want to appreciate all of her effort. I know Christina's helping out too, but thank you, Leah.
Absolutely. Right. And with that round of applause, we will go to our rental housing update.
Hi, I can go ahead and get us started. I'm going to share my screen if you'll just bear with me for a moment. Is that visible to everyone? Great. Wonderful. Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Amy Colbloom, and I'm here with you tonight to provide you with an update on the implementation of the city's Residential Rent Stabilization and Tenant Protection Ordinance, which you all know better as the Rrso. And I apologize, I'm going back and forth between 2 screens so I can make sure we're moving to the right slides. I'm going to start tonight's discussion with a background of the Rrso and overlay that a little bit with some of the key points regarding the COVID-19 protections over the last year and a half. Tonight, as we look at Rrso data, it's important that we keep in mind the overlap between the pandemic and what that means for the trends that we're looking at and people's experiences. Next, we'll talk through some of the key updates on the Rrso implementation. Then we'll cover a brief update on the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance, which Council enacted in July of last year. And I'll provide some very brief updates on the city's COVID-19 response as it relates to housing stability. And our division manager, Christina Morales, will go more into that with her informational update later on. So this slide combines some of our key events in the life of the Rrso with some important moments in our local and state response to COVID-19, particularly as it relates to housing stability. The Rrso was enacted in July of 2019, so just over 2 years ago. In March of 2020, which some of you may remember as the last in-person meeting of this task force. This body heard updates from staff and recommendations for revisions to the Rrso, which council adopted later in July of 2020. But also in March of 2020, council adopted a local moratorium on evictions. Subsequently, council extended the moratorium, and then the state passed a statewide eviction moratorium in August of 2020, which it has since extended twice. Currently, AB 832 is the law of the land in California, which has extended the moratorium on evictions through the end of September and created a recovery period through March of 2022, and has also allocated rental relief funds from state and federal sources. So now I'm going to bring our focus to some of the updates on the Rrso implementation. I want to call out that, as I said before, the majority of the Rrso's lifespan, so to speak, has been during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's important that we keep in mind when we're looking at this data this evening that we recognize the trends that we see are obviously influenced by the pandemic and its corresponding economic impacts and the eviction moratorium. So we're going to start by talking about petitions, and a lot of this will be kind of some review on the ordinance as well. So the new Rrso expanded the mediation and arbitration process for rent dispute resolution to include more covered rental units. And as a reminder, this is kind of the broad shortcut that covered rental units are, broadly speaking, multi-unit properties that were built before 1979. With a few other specifics. The process to review a rent increase is initiated by a petition from a tenant, and then there are other petitions as well that can be submitted by landlords. So petitions can be filed by tenants for unlawful rent increases, miscalculated banked rent increases, unlawful utility rent increases, if there's a decrease in housing services, or if there are health and safety or necessary repairs that the landlord won't fix. So those are the reasons that a tenant can file a petition. Landlords can file petitions to increase the rent above the threshold in order to get a fair return on their investment, or they can submit a petition to get approval for a capital improvement pass-through amount. So since the Rrso was passed in July of 2019, our office has received 50 petitions. The majority received, and I'm referring to the period from July of 2019 through June of 2021. So the majority that we've received have been resolved. Most of them were resolved in mediation, but some were resolved prior to mediation, and only a few have had to go all the way to arbitration. Our petitioners can specify more than one reason for the petition. So it can be a rent increase and an unlawful notice, a rent increase and a utility increase, those types of things. But for the most part, when we look at the data, about half of the petitions were for unlawful rent increases. Shifting gears to our termination notices. So the Rrso requires landlords to provide copies of any termination notice that they send to tenants. They have to send it to our office as well. The notices, just to be kind of clear about what those documents are, they're not documentation of an eviction, but instead they're notices to pay or quit, which are intended to be cured by the tenant, either by paying past due rent or by leaving the unit. So many of these can be cured. So it's an important caveat with this data that not all of these notices submitted to our office led to a displaced tenant. Another important caveat is that this is the data that has been submitted to us. It doesn't mean that every single landlord that gave their tenant a termination notice also gave our office a copy. And then we also, again, need to keep in mind that the majority of the time period that we're looking at here was during the pandemic, and we've indicated that for you with this fancy dotted line in March of 2020. So with these caveats in mind, our office received 446 termination notices from July of 2019 through June of 2021. And we can see in this data that there's a drop in the notices just before and during the first 6 months of the pandemic. And this trend is, and then they pick back up, as you can see in about September of 2020. So this trend is consistent with the state's first eviction moratorium, which was enacted in August 2020. And it requires that landlords file a 15-day notice to pay or quit when tenants are unable to pay their rent. So that's likely what those spikes are landlords complying with that part of the law. And once tenants receive that notice, they then have 15 days to provide their landlord with a declaration of financial distress due to COVID-19. And as we said earlier, the state moratorium was subsequently extended after that August date through September of 2021. Of the notices that we received, the vast majority were for failure to pay, which again lines up with what we know about how the pandemic is impacting renters. As I said before, this data doesn't necessarily reflect the displacement of tenants. It shows landlords who are complying with the state by noticing their tenants. And most recently in AB 832, the states required that landlords include information about rent relief on their termination notices. So that, combined with outreach from the city, from the county, from the state, likely means that many of these tenants weren't evicted and hopefully have received linkages to rental assistance. The other side of the notice discussion are the rent increase notices, which, like our termination notices, our landlords are required to submit to our office by the Rrso. Early in Rrso implementation, our office created a template notice. So it was a form that landlords could use to comply, because the Rrso is pretty prescriptive in what a landlord is required to include on a rent increase notice. So we created that form so that landlords can use that. And we see that a lot of the notices that come in are using our template. The number of notices dropped almost 70% from the first year of implementation to the second. We had noticeably fewer notices submitted during the 12 plus months of the pandemic that were submitted in the 7 months before. So we saw far fewer during the pandemic than in the time leading up to it. And there's actually a chart of that in your staff report. The average rent increase that we saw for covered rental units, so those that are covered by the 5% rent increase threshold, those on average were lower than those that weren't covered, which is what we would expect to see. On average, our covered rental units were about 4.8%, whereas those that weren't covered were just above 6%. And this time around, as we looked at our data with a little bit more data, we were able to look at market level data on a quarterly basis for comparison to rent increase submissions. This can be useful, but it has limitations. We've put them here in one chart, but it's important to note that it's not really an apples to apples comparison. One, because these are only the rent increases in the green bars that are submitted to us. And two, the market rent data is just for multi-unit properties, and it's just for new leases. So there are some gaps in that comparison. So that kind of big difference that you see, we have to keep that in mind, that the data is pretty different in some ways. The market data doesn't capture existing leases or changes to existing leases over time. So increases to an existing lease don't get captured in that rent increase in the gray bar. And so that means that there are still individual households out there that could get a substantial rent increase that's not really reflected in that gray data. As I said before, your staff report also includes a chart of the frequency with which we received rent increase notices over time by month. And when you compare that chart and look at how many rent increases were coming through over time, it really lines up with what we see in the market data. So we can't determine causation, but you can certainly look at them side by side and see some correlations. And you can compare the frequency of our market data rent increases with the rent increases that we received that suggests that while the market has been depreciating, we've also been seeing far fewer rent increases. So I'm going to shift gears away from the data, sorry, and talk talk about other kinds of data. So since the last update that we made to this group, we have launched the rent review database. So tenants and landlords can now go onto our website and search for their specific unit and see what portions of the Rrso are applicable to them. All of the tenant rights protections are most likely going to be applicable to all these units, but the key piece is for folks to see, am I covered by the rent increase threshold or not? The database also has some internal resources that are, eventually we will be able to build them out for external use, but right now for monitoring our petition process, that allows staff to much better track petition submissions and status in real time. And this is, I'm going to take a moment just to shout out our tech team partners with the city. They've been completely instrumental in getting this set up. And have helped us really clean up our data in the process. We are also really excited to share with you an update about the city's participation in the Eviction Prevention Learning Lab, the EPLL. The EPLL is a peer-to-peer learning network that's hosted in conjunction by the National League of Cities and the Stanford Legal Design Lab. And it's throughout the country, large cities, small cities, counties, different jurisdictions that come together. And the city has put together a team of housing staff, city attorney staff, community media relations staff, and then many partners from the community, nonprofits, residents, faith-based partners as part of our extended team. And we all attend sessions that help us. The city has focused in on understanding and building effective strategies for tenant and landlord education and community outreach and engagement. Those are our three main focus areas, which has proven to be incredibly useful in this time where we're trying really hard to get the word out to our community members about our COVID-19 resources, both available through the city and through the state and county. So we're also taking part as part of the EPLL in their kind of a side project for developing a public housing loss data tool, which is intended to help jurisdictions visualize both eviction and foreclosure data. And in doing so, through this pilot process, the city's begun some conversations with the Alameda County Superior Court to actually access eviction data, which should help the city evaluate eviction activity locally, which we currently can't do, and produce a geographic depiction at the zip code level of where evictions are occurring in the region and Hayward. And this is something that we previously thought was inaccessible. So I'm going to also take this moment to give a shout out to Christina for frankly just giving it another try. And we're really excited, and that's in the works right now. Sorry, Christina, but I wanted to also give you some updates on the outreach and education efforts. When we last met in March of 2020 to talk about the Rrso implementation updates, we had just hired Dana Gomez, our amazing program specialist. I'm just full of shout outs tonight, sorry. And she's just been off and running. Even with the pandemic, she has managed to do, I think we're tracking from July 2020 to July 2021, almost 40 different outreach and education events in this 12-month period. And as things are opening back up, she's really working hard to meet folks where they're at. So she's going to neighborhood and apartment complex block parties, doing HUSD events, downtown Hayward events. So she's really been out there pounding the tabling pavement and doing online workshops at the same time. Additionally, we track all of the inquiries that come through to the housing division. And since the Rrso was passed in July of 2019, through the end of June this year, or through July of 2021, we've had over 6,000 inquiries, and over half of them have been about the Rrso. And that ranges from rent increase questions, utility increase questions, and then we get inquiries from landlords as well about our rent review fee. And Even during that 2-year time period, which is a big block of time, part of which was not during the pandemic, we still see 22% of our total has been related to COVID. And that is primarily questions about rent relief and eviction protections. And we wanted to give you an update on the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance, which I apologize, I call it the Rrso. It's not pleasant on the ears, but it's faster. When Council amended the Rrso in July of last year, you also adopted this new ordinance called the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance. This ordinance requires that landlords pay relocation assistance under certain specific circumstances when a tenant becomes either permanently or temporarily displaced from their unit. And it aligns with new state law that was passed in January of 2020, which was part of the reason for including it. Since the implementation started in July of last year, staff have created several resources in multiple languages to facilitate compliance for landlords. We have so far worked with 12 cases through August of this year. Most of them have been initiated through a code enforcement notice of violation. We have, during that time, identified a trend where landlords owe assistance but are either unable or unwilling to make the required payments. So we have displaced tenants who aren't getting the required payment. And this is why Council approved using a portion of the city's stimulus funding to create the Tenant Relocation Assistance Fund, which we'll be able to use to ensure that tenants receive payments in a timely manner. And then in certain circumstances, the city will be able to recover those funds. Some of the strengths, just to tack on here about this ordinance of implementing it, has been because so many of the cases have been code enforcement related, it's really helped the housing and code enforcement divisions work more closely together. So we've done some cross training where we've come in and talked with the code enforcement team about some broader tenant and landlord rights and responsibilities. And they're joining us for some outreach around their rental inspection program. So we've been able to kind of combine forces in a lot of really positive ways. Additionally, we've also increased our working relationship with Eden Housing, one of the nonprofit developers in the region. They're working with us to put eligible displaced tenants at the top of their queue for affordable housing, as it is allowable and established in the regulatory agreement between the city and Eden. So that's the Tenant Relocation Assistance Ordinance. The staff report provides more detail on the different eviction and foreclosure protections that are available to tenants and homeowners through city programs and state law related to COVID-19. This is a brief list of what those are, and I'm actually going to defer for the sake of time to Christina to give you more context on this. And also you will hear from staff again on September 21st with an informational report on eviction and foreclosure data, as well as the city's efforts to support community members as the state eviction moratorium expires. Additionally, part of our next steps is that staff will be moving forward with setting up that Tenant Relocation Assistance Fund. And specific to the Rrso, we'll be continuing to monitor program data and continuing our outreach and education work and our local partnership building, particularly as we move towards the eviction moratorium expiring. And so that concludes the update on the Rrso. I appreciate your time, and I will pass it back to Councilmember Landon.
Thank you very much. And yes, many cheers to the staff, to you, Dr. Cole Bloom, and to all of the staff who are working together cross-departmentally. That's awesome. So, and bringing in new partners from the outside. So, cheers to everybody. Really appreciate that. So as we did last time, are there any comments from or questions from the community? Not seeing any hands raised from the public, so I will turn it back to my colleagues. Any questions or comments? Councilmember Wahab?
I'm going to volunteer to go first, but go ahead. Go ahead.
If you want, I'm happy to switch this out with you. All right.
Go ahead. Thank you.
No, I appreciate all the work you guys have done, to be honest with you guys, on the residential rent stabilization and tenant protection ordinance. I know that this entire task force in the last, 3 years that we've been kind of, chipping away at the housing issues in our city. For one, I do want the public to know that we did not have a tenant protection ordinance, right? So the mere fact that so many renters and basically individuals in our city are protected with some, equitable rules that apply to them as well as their landlords and predatory landlords is a plus. I do want to ask specifically, I am very interested and concerned about the foreclosures that we may see a significant spike in. So that is not necessarily rent related, but definitely just homeowner related, both commercial as well as residential. So that is something I'm going to be looking forward to seeing, and specifically what are we going to do about it. Number two is the mere fact that we have 5 different pieces in this entire ordinance that helps individuals stay in their homes, from just cause, which was not there, tenant retaliation protections, which was not really there, the provision to protect Section 8 voucher holders, which was not there. There's a lot there that I'm really proud that this task force, as well as the full city council, has really worked on, and staff, of course. I do want to say the tenant in the staff report, it was kind of unclear because it says COVID-19 response, but we did try to push the Tenant Relocation Assistance Fund prior to COVID. If I remember correctly, we first brought it up in 2019 and it slowly had to be tripped away. So I just want to make sure that that's in our ordinance completely, and we're moving forward with that. Just staff report wasn't clear. But I'd also want to commend you guys. I think the database. The first time we kind of got a briefing on the database was roughly in 2019, right? And it was made in-house. So I'm very eager to take a look at that and see how it's available. We have not advertised this to the public, correct?
It's actually been up on our website for, actually, Christina, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say we haven't done any advertisements for it, but as people access information from our office, we do let them know that the information is available. And we recently revamped, or we're in the process of revamping our web pages. So we're really making sure that it's more easily navigated. So it should be easier to access the information. But we also just did a Know Your Rights. We're actually about to mail out a Know Your Rights postcard that's going to go to every tenant in the city of Hayward, that will be one of those opportunities where we can highlight some of the information we have available.
Awesome. On top of the postcard, if we can make a social media post regarding this, and with our website, even when I sometimes browse what we've done, if we can make it very easy for, if you are a tenant, click this button and then this is all the information that pertains to you. If you were a landlord, this is what pertains to you. And if you're just a regular old-fashioned homeowner, this is what pertains to you, just making it very easy. I do also want to say that I just renewed my own lease, and I will say that the packet that they gave me, even though I have to initial like 180 pages, it's ridiculous, but it did not have the rent stabilization ordinance for briefing. It also did not have the percentage change. It also so there are landlords out there that still either are not informed as to what the new policies are, or they, in my property, they've changed ownership a couple times in the last 3 years. So I do just want to highlight that we still have to make it very easy for landlords to understand which documentation they are supposed to share with their tenants. I took note of that, and I was a little disappointed, but I also know we've had new landlords. So I just want to make sure that we constantly make that available. And I also want to highlight, we've done a lot of work around COVID that was not necessarily highlighted here, but just the amount of funds that we have actually given to folks, right? For example, there are many, I think the state as well as many other cities that have kind of adopted this fund for renters and property owners they haven't been pushing out the money actually, right? We have actually pushed out the money. So I do want to highlight that. So, so we are well aware of like how much the city has truly invested in this. And other than that, this was more of an informational item, not necessarily any action items, correct? Okay. I do, again, very much appreciate it. And I have nothing else to say, but congratulations on a job well done. I will say, Assistant City Manager Ott, you, Christina Morales, the entire housing team, Dr. Amy Cole-Bloom, and I know Jessica Lobodon is on this as well. So basically everybody within the housing team, I really just commend you guys for very much a hard work. And on top of that, we're gonna look at the housing ordinance coming soon. So I'm very happy for the work that you guys done, and you guys do deserve a kudos. So congratulations and thank you.
Christina and her team work very hard, and I appreciate all that they do.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Councilmember Salinas.
Yeah, so I want to share in the, you know, in all of the congratulatory comments. You know, I think over the last four or 5 months, as we begin to reopen, there's been a lot of questions, and of course, I've been referring them to the housing division, and when I, you know, loop back and, you know, and talk with the folks after I've referred them, they really have positive feedback. And, you know, I know we don't have a sort of a suggestion box, but there is a, you know, everyone I talk to who have engaged your office in the last, you know, 8 months, have nothing but positive things to say. And so and that's not even counting all the policy stuff that we've been doing. So, you know, we you know, so I thank you very much. I mean, it's just outstanding. If there is one thing that we have proven over, you know, the last 19 months, is that the housing division has been durable, and we've been able to you know, execute, you know, incredibly technical policies in incredible stressful times for families. And which leads me to my second comment, which is Deanna Gomez. I don't know where you found her. I don't know where she came from. I don't know. I don't know what she eats for breakfast, but she is fantastic. Families have done nothing but just. I mean, if there is one name that is dropped, it's Diana Gomez. And you know, talk about that really substantive community engagement work. She's out there talking and tabling, and you know, every time I turn and look, you know, at events that I've seen her at, she's always had a you know, a gathering of people, and they've so just fantastic. That was a good pick, and you know, so thank you. I did want to bring up one thing, and the data that was brought up about the charts and graphs you gave us were really good. And I don't expect us to go through this point now, but do we have, if we were to drill down on zip code, like the 94544 zip code, or if we were even to drill down on specific streets to look at impact of rent relief, is that possible? Could we do that? Like, and I'll just throw out some streets. Vermont off of B. I know there's multifamily unit housing over there. Of course, you got Upper B. Of course, you got, you know, Gadding, you know, in those areas. Do we have that capability if we were to really, you know, look at high impact?
We have, for the rent relief that the city put out, yeah, we could get data that specific. At the moment, we wouldn't be able to do that type of analysis with the county emergency rental assistance program funds. At this point right now, we just know totals for Hayward. But we could access that specific level data from the 670 households that receive funds from the city's program.
So you don't have to do it today, tomorrow, or even next month, but you know, if the opportunity arises where we're able to collect that kind of data, I would really like to see in what areas of the city. I think even like a you know, those GPS maps or like those heat maps that are produced, you know, sort of plotting out where these programs impacted Hayward the most, and just so that we can be better informed as we move forward. You know, I know I've asked, I've sort of have dropped this idea before, but I'm really, particularly in the last 18, 19 months, I think it's, I'm really interested to see the impact we've had on these dollars, and even moving forward. I know, you know, with the stimulus money, and I know this is sort of another topic, but even with the stimulus money that we're distributing, is really looking at impact that we've had in the neighborhoods, and that's so. Anyways, I'll stop there. But outstanding work. You know, just this was a good staff report to read, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. The only thing I have to add is just sort of the ongoing dialogue about rent and rent increases in our community and housing affordability. And I appreciate sort of the thought partnership. You know, these are not new conversations, and that there's ongoing thought about how do we crack this. And, you know, the only sort of new idea that came to mind that I just wanted to sort of throw in the mix was the idea of, you know, for properties where their property tax value is low because it's an older property, they've paid it off, et cetera, you know, to look at the intersection of, if you're charging a rent that gives you a really high profit margin, well, I understand that that was the design, but that's really not sustainable for our community anymore. And so how do we get at that in a substantive way? I'm not asking for answers tonight. I just kind of wanted to put it on the table as food for thought of, you know, housing as a commodity is part of what is driving all of these problems. And so, yeah, I don't have a big answer for that, obviously, but I look forward to ongoing thought partnership about how do we crack that. So, other than that, as I said, appreciate the work. The one other piece, sorry, that I'll add to that really quick is just, you know, the Alameda County, or the federal government actually, you know, subsidizes rents to the tune of $11 million a month. And so if people want lower taxes, and that's tax money that does that. So if people want lower taxes, then charge less rent. So I'll just put that out there. So again, thank you. Our final item tonight is an informational item. I'm thinking that there's not necessarily a staff report on this. Is that correct? Or a staff presentation on this? This is just an informational. We read it.
Correct. Yes, it was just to make sure that the task force had the latest information on what was going on at the state level, both in terms of funding programs and legislation. And of course, it's probably already out of date, but we had to take a snapshot of where we were, but that things are changing rapidly. And so we can keep the task force informed of what happens.
I think the second item, though, is about evictions and foreclosures, which there is no staff report, but a presentation. Is that correct? The next item on the agenda.
I apologize. I skipped that one. My apologies.
I skipped it with you. So good thing we have Christina here to keep us on track.
Excellent. Okay, let us do that. Presentations.
Yeah, I made everything smaller and now I can't share my screen. Okay, hold on a second.
Christina, I can share it if that's easier.
I've got it. Just
okay.
All right there, everyone can see it, correct?
Sorry, yes, and just to be clear, so we actually didn't skip it. It was the next item. So,
Oh, it was. Okay,
yeah,
I apologize.
No, it's all good. Stay right where you are. Don't change a thing.
Okay.
I just want to sort of, for those following, reading in the liner notes. So we had the informational report. There's no staff item on that, but if my colleagues have, need additional information, or there's something that needs to be brought up at a future meeting, by all means, let me know or let our city staff know. But really appreciate that update. So that was item 4. Christina, take it away for item 5.
All right, thank you. So good evening, everyone. I'm Christina Morales, Housing Division Manager, and hopefully some of this will answer some of the questions that came up before. As Amy had mentioned, there is some overlap between the rent stabilization presentation update that we gave you before and some of this eviction and foreclosure briefing. Because we, as requested in the last Homeless and Housing Task Force meeting, we're preparing these briefings so that we can maintain kind of our fingers on the pulse in terms of what's happening in the realm of evictions and foreclosures. So we'll be discussing, as I mentioned, eviction and foreclosure, but we also wanted to include information on kind of the community support systems that are in place as we're looking at the state's eviction moratorium concluding at the end of September. So important to note, while we're monitoring it, we're also looking at what types of protections are available so that we can inform community members about what their rights are and what the responsibilities of the landlords as well. And so as you'll see, there is some overlap because we take the information on the termination notices that about 96% of terminations notices filed with the city were related to failure to pay rent. And this is, we're looking at this because we have really no published data on evictions in Alameda County. So we're using the information we have to kind of assess the risk of individuals possibly facing eviction at the end of the state's eviction moratorium. But we think it's important to note that these evictions can be cured by either paying rent or moving out, and that the state legislation has also added a requirement that tenants can respond to their landlords with a financial distress form so that would also stop the eviction process. So there's those safeguards in place that if they haven't paid their rent through September 30th, that they're really protected from eviction. And so also noted earlier that since there's no published data, we have reached out to the Alameda County Superior Court. And since we were giving so many shout outs, I want to give a shout out also to the Alameda County Superior Court for working with us and talking us through the process of how we can obtain information about evictions, which they will be able to provide us at least on a zip code level. So we'll get data not only about get data about the volume of evictions. We're hoping to use the housing loss tool so we can see on a map where the occurrences are and if there's a concentration of them and any kind of disparate impacts. So we're very excited about that development. But also knowing that there are people who are impacted by evictions and how do we support those members of the community. We also looked into the pulse data from the US Census Bureau because it would give us a sense of what's going on in the community since we didn't have any court data. And so what it's showing really is that there about 84% of households are caught up on their rent. But we have a disparity between people who earn less than $75,000 a year and those that earn more than $75,000 a year. So we're really looking at people who are lower income having a greater impact and greater difficulty paying their rent. And so what we also see is the number of people who are concerned about paying their next month's rent, and then those that are concerned about eviction. And we see those numbers fairly high being concerned about eviction when we have so many protections in place with the rental assistance and the state moratorium that would be protecting people. So it helps us become aware of where we need to focus efforts on in terms of outreach. because if people are not aware that they have these protections, they may not be able to access them. So the information and data tells us a lot in terms of really looking at helping lower income households in Hayward get access to information so that they can leverage the existing protections that are in place. And just an overview, kind of mentioned it throughout, but of the protections that are available. We just recently, the Supreme Court ended the federal eviction moratorium, but luckily in California, we still do have the state moratorium in place that's effective through the end of this month. And within those protections, we know that anyone who was unable to pay their rent from March 2020 through September 2021, those individuals are protected from non-payment of rent during that period, because the landlord can only recover the rent that was not paid through small claims court. So they wouldn't be able to use the eviction process to collect that past due rent. There's also provisions in the state legislation that if a tenant is actively seeking rental assistance, they have protection from eviction. So that has individuals moving forward. So if they're unable to pay October's rent, but they're seeking rental assistance, it gives that additional layer of protection as they're in the process. There's lots of, I may oversimplify it for just the expediency of discussing it. There are different requirements for that, but it is in essence a way to keep people housed while they're in the process of getting financial assistance. There's also provisions that if the landlord refuses to participate or doesn't accept the rental assistance, that when a judge is looking at what's owed to the landlord, they may reduce what they could have received through the rental assistance. And we also have information on the rental assistance that has been available. So the city has provided $1.5 million in rental assistance serving 670 households. And Alameda County has about $61 million available, less their administrative costs to provide in rental assistance. And we know now that there have been 1,677 applications from the city of Hayward. I believe that data may include addresses in unincorporated Alameda County, but the requests are totaling nearly $33 million. To date, 223 applications have been approved, dispersing $3.7 million in rental assistance. We also looked at foreclosure data. Luckily, we do have access to information on in public records for foreclosure data. So we provided information on the various stages of a foreclosure. It will usually begin with a notice of default, which would be considered pre-foreclosure. Then the property is then scheduled to be, and that has after 90 days, they can schedule a notice of trustee sale, and that's another 90-day period. And then after the property is auctioned, if there was no higher bidder, the property is then acquired by the lender who holds the note to the property. And so what we're seeing right now is there's about 22 in all three of these stages. I believe we looked, I was trying to find the data before the last time we looked, I believe there was 12 properties. So we are seeing an increase in the number of properties that are going through the foreclosure process. So we're going to continue to monitor the activity and look at different ways to support community members who may be going through financial distress and unable to pay their mortgage. Similarly, we looked at the pulse data as well to kind of get a sense of what the bigger picture is in terms of inability to pay mortgage. So the rates on being current on the mortgage are higher for homeowners than it was for renters. So we're seeing about 92% are caught up on their payments. Those concerned about paying next month at 4%. And those that think they may have to leave their home in the next 2 months due to foreclosure at about 3%. Once again, seeing that same disparity between lower income households and higher income households. And that we have that lower income households are more impacted, but not at the same rate as lower renters. And so we're looking at these different items, but when we consider it may be a small percentage, but when you apply that to the number of households or homeowners in the city of Hayward, it's still a sizable number of people who would be impacted. So looking at that, we consider the protections that are currently available to individuals. And so we know that the forbearance period that was required by federal law, extended forbearance periods initially for 6 months and could be extended for up to 18 months. So we're going to start seeing more properties that are going to be near the end of that forbearance period. Some of those may be able to modify their loan and avoid default or foreclosure, but others may have difficulty at paying all of that past due mortgage. So one of the things that the city has done already is that we funded a contract with A1 Community Housing Service to provide foreclosure prevention counseling. The city has also, using the federal stimulus funds, has identified, has allocated $1 million to be able to provide financial assistance to low-income homeowners who cannot otherwise address the COVID-related delinquency. So we're looking to partner with an organization that could not only help administer the program, but to counsel the homeowners and hopefully first try to help them negotiate with their lenders and modify their loans, and look really at your loan agreement or your promissory note is really it's a legal document. So looking at it in that context and that everything was done according to law, and if not, pursue that matter. And if there's no other way, that the city would then be able to provide the financial assistance as a loan to cure the default. So we are starting to implement that. We have the RFP that was released in August. We hope to select a consultant by October and seek council approval on October 19th. So we're really trying to fast track this program so that it's going to be in place before we see too many foreclosures being pursued. And so in general, when we're looking at this data and what it's telling us, it speaks a lot to people not knowing or being aware of the programs that are and protections that are available to them. So we've been increasing the community outreach to ensure that the community residents are aware of these programs. As I mentioned earlier, we've sent out we're in the process. I feel like we've sent it because we've already approved it, and I think we have it going to the printer very soon. But the Know Your Rights postcard that's going to go out to the community. We're also including an insert in the rent stabilization fee bill that will be a Know Your Rights and Responsibility informational handout for landlords. Thanks to Deanna and all the great work she's been doing. She's been attending a sizable number of community events, as you saw in the previous presentation. And we have monthly workshops about rental housing issues that we've been hosting via Zoom. We continue to do that, and we're also looking to expand our list of community partners so we can expand our reach by making sure we're sending the information to community-based organizations, faith-based organizations. So in addition to a meeting with the public, Diana is building those relationships with those organizations so we can have a broader outreach to the public at large. We're also promoting the Alameda County Rental Assistance Program, and the city has our mediation service that is to help individuals who have past due rent that may not qualify for rental assistance, so that they can have assistance in mediating a repayment plan so that they can avoid not only the foreclosure process in the event it has to go to small claims court. We think both tenants and landlords may benefit from the ability to avoid court and go to this free service where they can really help develop a reasonable repayment plan. Additionally, we'll continue to promote foreclosure counseling, implement the financial assistance program for low-income homeowners. And Amy also mentioned this as well, leveraging this technical assistance from the Eviction Prevention Learning Lab to improve eviction prevention strategies. So we're really learning a lot. We've already sought some technical assistance that has given us some alternative ways to look at outreach and increasing our ability to connect with the community. And then looking at things, I think one of the things we've learned in this process is reaching out to the courts and finally finding the right person who says, yes, we can do it, kind of continuing along those lines and seeing what other how else we can impact others in the foreclosure process to really support community members if they have to face a foreclosure or an eviction, to get access to information. And I am available for questions.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for all that work. Again, opening up to the community. If there's any questions or concerns, I see Rrso. Yeah, Rrso Aguilar.
Hi.
Good evening.
I just want to, I don't think you should have saved this presentation for last. It is amazing. I just want to congratulate all of you and express my appreciation for the work you're doing on the rental assistance, the tenant protection, eviction prevention, foreclosure prevention. I, like you, share a great concern about what's going to happen within the next year, where the homelessness numbers are going to go. And I just wanted to put in a word for your hotel motel program. I know you have one hotel. I haven't heard anything about it, and maybe that would be a good presentation for one of the meetings. But I just think that if you can expand on that program with state funding, that would be a good back plan for those that we can't help with these other programs when they're out on the street and don't have any place to go. This hotel motel assistance program, to me, is really a lifesaver, and it could be a long-term help for people who are trying to get back on their feet. So just wanted to put in a word for that. Didn't want to miss the opportunity to say hi to everybody. And really, I'm so impressed with this meeting. I can't tell you how happy it makes me that we have a council and a staff. I also want to express appreciation to staff that's right on top of everything and compassionate. And thank you. Good night and have a good evening. I'm glad I stayed till the end.
We're glad you stayed too. Thank you, Rrso. Seeing no other comments from the public, I'll turn it back to my colleagues. Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. So one, if Rrso is happy, I know we're doing a good job. But I do want to say, I think that, you know, I appreciate the informational report. I know that the city of Hayward has been doing far better than our region, right? Just the numbers that we're pushing out, the effort that we've been making pre-COVID and during COVID. So I do just want to highlight that. I am deeply concerned about the foreclosure potentially crisis moving forward. I think that that's a big concern of mine. During the Great Recession, that is how my family lost their home, and I'm, you know, that's going to be my number one concern. And I know that, do you believe that we would potentially see an extension from the state in September?
We consulted with the lobbyists, and it does not appear that the state will extend the moratorium.
Okay. I don't know if we will be extending it at, you know, at a certain point, you know, we're going to exhaust our extensions and we're going to eventually have to deal with reality. The reality is also that there's going to be both commercial and residential property owners that are going to be struggling to see what that is. Do we have a true analysis of people who have reached out saying that they are deeply concerned with making their mortgage payments in the city of Hayward, that have reached out to the office in particular?
I don't have that data. I would have to look at, our call log does document the types of inquiries we get, so I could see how many people had identify needing assistance for regarding home ownership, and see from there. I think what the Pulse data does tell us kind of in our region, even though it's not specific to Hayward, it does give us kind of a sampling in terms of the percentage of people who may not be caught up on their mortgage payments or their rents, which can help us kind of gauge our focus on we need to help and prioritize. But I definitely think, considering that I think it was 94% of the individuals were caught up, the flip side, I think it was 92, so 8% are not caught up. That's a sizable number of households, and if they're low income, makes it even more difficult to get caught up. And so that's why we are having our program in place, hopefully by the end of this year, that we can, right now they can participate in the foreclosure counseling to work on that dialogue with their lenders, and then hopefully have the financial assistance in place by the end or the beginning of next year, so that we can help people if the only way to cure the delinquency is to pay it and provide it as a loan.
Okay. And I am very much interested in this, and I think that this is a good option. I will also say that I'm going to bring up my own personal issues with this. In the past, my own family has dealt with this. We did the same program. We followed all the rules. It still didn't work out, right? Because it at the end of the day, it's the bank's decision. And so that doesn't always help everybody. I do want to say that I know when that they foreclose, do we have anything in place that the city of Hayward gets first dibs? I know, for example, if they are delinquent on their property taxes, the assessor takes it and we get first dibs. If we do have something, potentially an ordinance in place or something that says that if a foreclosure does happen, the bank is potentially required to sell to us or, deal with us, and we try to figure out how we can make sure that these homes are affordable or potentially even sold back to the original owner at a realistic, what is actually makes sense. It's something like that type of potential deal that I think would be able to allow people to stay in place, keep their home, and increase intergenerational wealth, which we know is ownership. So I am looking for something like that as well. I know I've mentioned it in the past, if we are able to do that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so state law does allow cities, nonprofit housing providers, and the tenants that occupy properties that are being foreclosed the right to last and final offer. So after the property goes to auction, whatever that bid was, I think that the tenant only has to match the bid, and the city would be able to, I think, offer $1 more. So they have the last and final offer. That's why I think that one of the other plans we have for using the stimulus funds is to try to use some of those stimulus money to acquire the properties, or help nonprofit or community land trusts acquire the properties, to avoid that the properties go to investors, and make sure they stay as a community asset, either by being maintained as affordable housing or being owned by the tenant. So we do have that on our list of projects to do, thinking of in terms of the process for foreclosure, get the immediate assistance to the owners available first, and then we work on our plan to try to capture properties that may get lost due to foreclosure and retain them as a community asset.
Okay. This is of utmost importance to me, just because I will say right now, we know that we had roughly near 4,000 people lose their jobs in the city of Hayward due to COVID, right? That was the last analysis I read. Number one. Number two is we do have a large Black and brown community, but our number one homeless population is older white community members too. So I just want to state that Hayward is still probably one of the most affordable cities in the Bay Area still. And as much as we can help our community members stay here and not have to move further out, the better. So that is of deep interest, and I do like that plan. And if we were to do that, would we be able to make the homes deed restricted then? I know Councilmember Lamnan always likes to say deed restricted. Are we able to do that then?
Definitely, if we're working with nonprofit developers or community land trusts, the properties will be deed restricted. In terms of working with the homeowners, we probably have to evaluate what mechanism works best. Also thinking about when we're looking at helping lower income individuals acquire property, when we deed restrict or have recaptures that are very high, we also limit the ability to build wealth. So we should kind of consider those trade-offs as well when we're looking at helping individuals acquire property.
Okay. And I'm sure we're going to do a full analysis. I just want those potential options, even if it's a percentage, even if it's a style of home, right? Whatever we can. But I do like the kind of mental pathway that you are already on. So I appreciate it. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Salinas?
No, I'm good report. Thank you.
Thank you. Agreed. I don't have anything to add either. Which takes us to the future agenda items. Were there anything from my colleagues that you wanted to make sure we talked about at some point? Hearing none, we will move on. Our next meeting will be December 2nd, and we'll look at that strategic plan or our strategic roadmap, the incentives to housing production, as our assistant city manager mentioned earlier. And with that, I will ask if there's anything else for the good of the order. And if not, have a lovely evening. Thank you, everybody. Great work.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, Yolanda. Bye, Diana.